Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's episode centers around consumer sentiment on the connected car taking place right now. And you're here with me, Anna Büttner, alongside Janina Mills, Consumer Research Lead, and Brian Rhodes, Associate Director for Connected Car and Vehicle Experience. Hello to you both, and thank you for joining this week's episode of Autology.
Thanks
Thanks
for
for
having
having
us.
All right, so I have an easy question for you to kick things off, and it's really on behalf of listeners not playing in this connected car space directly. And the question is, why do we care, and why is this understanding of consumers here so important? Maybe Jana, you can start us out here.
Yeah. And I guess just a little bit more generally, I think this goes to what we're witnessing in the automotive industry as an evolution of the entire vehicle. We're transitioning away from some of those traditional elements like engine performance or exterior designs to really show off and showcase the vehicle. And granted, those are still fairly important, but we're starting to see that the experience consumers have within the cabin itself is very much the focus these days, especially with things, the megatrends of CASE or ACEs or whatever acronym you want to use to represent that automation, connectivity, electrification, and shared services. These are changing the overall vehicle configurations. And obviously, with that comes a lot of opportunity, especially to enhance the overall experience for the occupants. So I think as it continues to evolve, I think we'll see even more emphasis on connectivity and other enhancements to the in-vehicle experience to accommodate some of these changing needs. So overall perception of a vehicle and brand is increasingly coming from that interior or the cabin experience.
Yeah, and just to add to that, in terms of why do we care as an industry about this space? We've heard a lot of pretty lofty targets from automakers in terms of how much they want to or maybe need to generate from this space in terms of revenue. To give a few examples, we've heard Volkswagen say that by 2030 they intend to make 20% of their revenues from subscriptions and mobility services. OnStar, same timeline, 2030, has mentioned $25 billion as their target for software services and subscriptions. See a similar number, not too much less than that, around 20 billion from Stellantis. Renault, 20% from these services. So, this is, we talk about $25 billion, 20% of revenue. This is hugely significant. These also come with incredibly high margins. So that revenue figure is actually even more important than it sounds, considering margins of these services versus traditional building and selling of vehicles. I also think the other angle here, beyond revenue, is kind of piggybacking on what you just said, Yana, is the loyalty aspect too. So it's you've got the consumer perception and all of this that goes into selecting and then ultimately purchasing a vehicle. But then there's another conversation about how sticky that consumer remains with that vehicle and with these services, and keeping them in the ecosystem that will have them coming back to that automaker's service center, or coming back to them when their vehicle lease is up or they're ready for their next car. And keeping them in the ecosystem going forward is a very important part of the discussion. And a lot of these services are oriented at, again, just sort of keeping sticky with your customer over time.
Okay, very good. And yes, you hinted at this. Of course, this isn't a new market with the likes of OnStar operating since the 1990s. But what are some of the newer developments, and are they making consumers more interested in subscribing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I think some of this is what I had just mentioned, right? What's new is that the richness of features is growing so much that there is a path forward to some of these massive revenue targets. To this point, you mentioned OnStar. They've been a bit of an exception to the rule with, OnStar is about a $2 billion business with very high margins. That's significant, but no one else is really close to that. So I think one of the aspects to this is just that everybody, almost everybody, has a play in this space. It's not just technology leaders. And also, I guess it's worth mentioning, should be obvious since we gave the example of OnStar to start. This isn't like let's say a typical technology curve that might start from luxury, flagship trim, and then it slowly trickles down over time, like we see many components come. When we say OnStar, we're talking about Chevy just as much as we're talking about Cadillac, right? So that's one aspect here that makes for bigger waves, I think, more impact to more people and more vehicles. But yeah, to this point of, everyone has a play, it's a priority for Toyota, as for, Hyundai actually just recently announced a nearly $13 billion investment in the space that includes a shift to some function on demands. You might call function on demand, you might call it paid update, hardware abstraction. There's a lot of different terms for this, but the concept of hardware being built into the vehicle that the consumer then can unlock over time. So maybe it's like a virtual trim where you buy a vehicle, doesn't have heated seats, but eventually you decide you want those heated seats and you can pay to have that turned on. This is a concept that's growing, and it's new in some senses, in that so many different automakers are offering it now that, broadly speaking, consumers are starting to become aware of the topic. But in other senses, a lot of people have been doing this for a long time. The traditional, the U.S. side of Fiat Chrysler has been equipping a lot of head units with navigation, for instance, and offering the ability to pay $200 to enable that navigation. From their perspective, it wasn't this huge opportunity to make more money. It was just a simpler way to deploy head units in vehicles, to not have to worry about all the different trim mixes. So I think that aspect of this is changing quickly, and it's not limited to a handful of brands like it was in the past. Another thing that's new here is, with the heightened importance and all these revenue targets and the loyalty conversation we've been having, there's such a focus on conversion for activating. So, most, you buy a new vehicle, many of them are going to offer some free trial, whether it's 3 months or it's 10 years, they're going to offer something. There's such an emphasis right now on getting that conversion of the free trial, because then it's okay. Can we prove the value here to you to continue this service over time? But you can't even have that conversation if the customer doesn't take over the free trial, or adopt that free trial to start. So I think, a lot of the investments on the user experience side and making activation super easy, making it like activating, your Spotify account. It needs to be 2 steps. It can't be 15 steps, right? Like it traditionally used to be in the car. So I think some of these developments are removing some of the barriers that might have been there before for a consumer actually experiencing some of these things.
Yeah, and to sort of continue off on that from what you're saying, Brian, from our consumer survey, we saw that 53% of our respondents had some sort of active connected services, and these were typically activated at the dealership or through the automaker's smartphone app. So that simplicity is kind of what's driving a lot of this. But as far as like that conversion you're talking about, we saw a whopping 82% said that they would renew their subscription or purchase one after their free trial ended. 82%. I found that pretty interesting. And most often, we saw that maintenance features and services were most common subscriptions, even though navigation has typically been the traditionally highest subscriber feature. We saw that safety and security had the highest number of users in free trial periods. And we even found greater than 50% of consumers actually purchased those features after the initial vehicle purchase. So those paid updates you were talking about. And those were, again, typically around safety or navigation features. So there seems to be this increasing interest in connectivity, but more specifically, some of the more vehicle-centric features and content. And this is likely because there are a number of convenience or entertainment features that they already get from their consumer electronics, right? Their smartphones that they bring into the vehicle. And as part of our survey, we also asked those that, if they wouldn't renew or purchase the subscription after the free trial period, a majority actually said having similar services on their smartphones was the most reason for not renewing or purchasing. And so we also looked at what consumers actually wanted, and both navigation and safety related services and paid updates were the most highly desired. And not only that, but consumers were also willing to pay for them. So it's one thing to want those features, it's an entirely different thing to actually be willing to pay. So, other than things like infotainment, where we saw satisfaction was pretty high, they also had the lowest number of respondents who were willing to pay. So because, aside from the redundancy issue of having similar services on their consumer devices, the cost of services was another barrier. So it appears that consumers are increasingly more interested in these connected services and paid updates. But again, more so for that vehicle-centric content that justifies that cost of purchasing. And actually, just to continue on that, there's also a possible risk of overwhelming the consumers, and especially in this everything subscription trend. And Brian, you actually had a great presentation not too long ago about some of the headlines that we've seen where automakers are facing backlash for some of those subscription offerings, which is exactly the kind of bad press that I think a lot of companies face without having that deeper understanding of some of the consumer expectations for specific features and services, but more so in how to introduce these types of services and updates.
Yeah, it's a good point, Yana. And I feel like anytime we talk about this topic, one of the first things that comes up is, boy, I have a lot of subscriptions already. Do I really want to add on to that for my car? Um, I think there's aspects of this sort of subscription shift that I think is a bit generational. I think there's other aspects to it that are um, there's aspects of our lives that we've accepted can make sense in a subscription environment, right? This shift from cable TV to maybe streaming services isn't, it isn't so dramatic. You were still subscribing to that payment of cable in a way, right? But when it comes to heated seats in your car, we saw this headline that got a ton of clicks, a ton of bad press around it. It's because it's a foreign thing for us. The concept of kind of owning a thing, but there's a feature within it that you can't unlock. It can be the perception there can be that maybe something was stripped away that I've already paid for and I already have ownership of. Now, in reality, I think a lot of this does come down to implementation, and this is where many automakers have struggled to the point of, I think, setting the conversation back a little bit, like for the heated seats, for instance. The thought process here is, hey, I'm BMW. Most of my 90% of the US already has a heated seat if you have a BMW, right? This is for that 10%. So I can just put heated seats on every car. I don't need to worry about the inventory management of these vehicles. And then for those 10% that haven't unlocked it, we'll give you the option after the fact if you want to turn it on. There's really no net loss for the consumer there. It's just another option that you can say, no, I don't want it, or maybe you want it, after some period of time. But the way this initially was launched, actually, some owners that already had heated seats in South Korea were given the notification that now they had to pay for it, right? So these people already paid for the option. This is just a miscommunication, right? It's a notification that went out to somebody that shouldn't have gotten it, but then that goes viral, right? And that's the world we live in. So, I think a lot of the marketing push, the clean and polished approach to a mid-cycle refresh or a new vehicle is not getting the same attention for these connected services because we continue to see flubs here, mistakes at launch. We have many other examples. The heated seat one is taking a lot of pressure, but yeah, Jan, as you mentioned, we talk about a lot of these bad examples frequently. So I think if we're extending this subscription conversation into areas of our lives that we're not familiar with, the way we're introduced to it is very important. And I'd say so far, it's not going great.
Excellent. So you certainly touched on what consumers want here, and maybe also what they don't want so much. But can you also say who's doing this best from an OEM perspective? And if you can, how do you really measure that?
Well, I guess an obvious way to sort of track and measure is by the number of activations and conversions to paid subscribers from the free trials. And clearly, this is a strong strategy for automakers is to offer those free trials in an effort to lure them into the paid subscriptions. And depending, on the feature categories, it can be pretty effective. Consumer exposure to these services, and obviously the brands that are offering it is really important to sort of establish and solidify a certain perception, hopefully a positive one, of the services and the brand associated with that experience. Typically, we've seen more of the local or the regional brands in each country that we've surveyed in having the most positive consumer perceptions, or consumers having a good opinion of a certain brand or service. And 85% of our respondents said that they would recommend their connected services brand to a friend. But beyond sort of those local brands, we've seen Audi Connect and BMW Connected Drive score very highly across multiple markets, which could be attributed to the fact that maybe they've been more established in the market for longer. They have a broader service portfolio, and they typically target more affluent consumers that are often, willing and able to pay for the services compared with some of the more mainstream or volume brands.
Yeah, and I think another way we've started to measure success, and this becomes a little bit less straightforward than what Yana had described, is looking at the flexibility that brands approach this market with. So by flexibility, I mean the willingness to change pricing and change the mix of features. If there's, let's say, 5 different packages, kind of swapping where the features belong and taking this one from safety and moving it into this one of convenience because that's what your consumers are telling you. Easier said than done, right? This is something that exists in our consumer electronics world. We see package and pricing mixes change all the time based on how things are happening in real time. But not everyone has the ability to do this to their fleet of connected vehicles. So, I think Audi and BMW scoring highly, it makes sense. These are a couple of brands that have, shown the flexibility to put something out there and take it back and again adjust pricing and things. I think this is another reason why OnStar is such a significant name in this space. If you log into the OnStar website where it has sort of all the packages and pricing every week, you see these little tweaks constantly, and it's just this constant feedback loop with what their buyers are telling them and sort of trends and how these packages are being sold and how these features are being used. So I think that's another area where you can see maybe not success in the immediate, but success over time are those people that are constantly tweaking and adjusting these packages.
So the feedback is definitely going somewhere when in regard to this. I totally agree. Now switching gears here a little bit, what about the topic of data privacy then, with connectivity in the vehicle and access to consumer vehicle data? Do you think consumers may take a step back or feel put off by the risk of something like data misuse?
Yeah, I mean, there's always that underlying fear that their data might fall into the wrong hands or might be used for something else. So, but surprisingly, a high number of people are actually willing to share their vehicle data, especially if they get something in exchange. And our survey actually showed nearly 3/4 of consumers are willing to share their vehicle data in exchange for free connected services. So this just goes to show that maybe, while data and privacy and security is always a concern, and will likely continue to be a concern, it really comes down to the question of value and whether the services and content that they get in return are actually worth the risk. 8% of our respondents said that they wouldn't, and primarily this was due to security concerns, but also not understanding the value in it. So in the latter case, of the question of value or understanding the value, I think maybe greater transparency and education may help the consumer understand and weigh the pros and cons a little bit more accurately. But overall, I wouldn't say that consumers feel completely deterred by this, and results show that they actually place greater trust in automakers now than they have in previous years. And nearly 70% entrust either automakers or tech companies or both with their data and privacy.
Yeah, and I do think there's quite a bit of regionality to this question as well. Sort of depends on the market we're talking about. But to Yana's point, I think we've consistently seen, in particular in the US and China, a willingness to trade privacy for convenience. So, in cases where you're willing to accept targeted advertising for getting access to new content, this is an area that is certainly happening in the connected services space as well. And I also feel like there's still a big conversation around cybersecurity in automotive, but we're a little farther removed from some of the significant headlines of vehicle hacking and things like that probably play a role in some of that trending, Yana, that you mentioned. Um, just to add another angle to this, there's another perspective on some of the cybersecurity aspect, and that sort of goes the other way. With this conversation on paid updates, a lot of or some industry conversation has sparked around what they call data theft or license theft. And that's, I own a vehicle that I can pay extra money to turn on the headlight or, matrix headlights or heated seats. I hack into my own car and turn that feature on myself. This is this is a reality, as strange as it might sound, in the new world we live in. And obviously, that term, license theft or data theft, that's coming from the automaker's perspective because hey, that's my pie, right? So it's interesting. I don't think this isn't popular enough to be something that's really coming up in our consumer survey in any way. It's more of something you'll see like on message boards and things. And again, you'll hear industry members talk about. But I do think it's something to pay attention to, and we're starting to see some automakers come out with, what's their response going to be. I have seen the response be removing the warranty on the vehicle. So if this is a new vehicle, that is a significant cost, right? Removing the warranty, 100,000-mile powertrain warranty or something on that because you've unlocked a feature that maybe you weren't supposed to or they didn't intend for you to. That's it's a big hook, I think. But yeah, just wanted to throw that into the mix, sort of next level of complexity that I don't think anybody foresaw a few years ago.
Yeah, almost sounds like a bit of a power struggle there. But then, let's. I have one final question here for you, and I'd like to know what's one of the or what is the one finding that surprised you the most when reviewing this particular survey around the connected car topic? Jana, maybe you can go first.
Yeah, and I think I already mentioned it. Just the high percentage of respondents who were willing to repurchase or renew their subscription or to purchase after a trial period. I think it was 82%. And I think that's a really high number if you really think about it. I know that maybe some of the OEM reporting is a little different, but just coming from the horse's mouth, consumers themselves are really quite enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, equally surprising. I think there's two aspects to this. So, we're talking about 80%. First of all, it just goes to show how vital it is for the automaker to get people taking that free trial. If there's this high of an appetite to continue access and pay for that access afterwards, it's issue 1, 2, and 3 for the OEM to get you to take the free trial, right? If we know that this is an enticing offering. So that leads us into this world of incentivizing dealers to do it, or maybe forcing you to sign up, or giving you so much free content that it's silly if you don't. So some lease arrangements I know are set up in a way that you have to download the app and get access to the connected service platform, and then you get your free oil changes while you have your lease. So kind of they already were giving free oil changes for leases before, but now they've added extra steps to get you in that conversion funnel because of what Yana just mentioned, because there is such a high appetite for these. And yeah, that 80% is much higher than what we've seen in the traditional renewal funnel. That OEMs would report. It's a lot closer to like 10% and lower. I think there's a few reasons behind that difference. Number one is some of these packages are, we're not always talking about monthly or annual subscriptions. This might be a 5-year package you sign up to. So, there could be strong appetite after the trial that gets you to sign up to a multi-year package. And then, after 5 years, maybe you've had this vehicle for 5, 7, 8 years now, and the technology might have not kept up with what that feature offering was before. I think another aspect to this too is that a lot of we're seeing such a boom in rich content that's going into these feature packages that I think the kind of industry reported numbers are maybe a little bit behind some of the consumer perception of these features. Like in the US right now, virtual personal assistants are very hot. Having Alexa in your car is a very attractive feature to people today. So, we haven't had a huge history of multiple years of people that have had Alexa in their car, so, or in an embedded experience at least, or a really nice seamless experience. So maybe this 80% is something that we see drag those industry numbers up once first renewal comes for an Alexa related package, for instance.
Very good. Thank you for these insights. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. A big thank you to you both for joining Atology.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Anna.
And thank you to all you listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our atology@spglobal.com email, and you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Atology podcast. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.